Afternoon to you all. Today, my topic is neuroplasticity and stress, which is the first of the stress resilience model. Before we start, I'd like to tell you that what I'll be trying to do is give you a overview of the topic. It's a very vast topic, but I'll try and make it as painless as possible uh, and with the least stress. So, the disclaimer: this is based on current available literature, and I really don't have any conflicts of interest. Uh, so basically, the outline, we'll go through what stress is. We'll look at what stress and the biological response to stress entails. We'll look at neuroplasticity and how stress affects neuroplasticity over time. We'll also at the end look at whether there is any evidence if interventions can change these responses, specifically neuroplasticity itself. So coming to stress, stress is a process involving perception, appraisal, and response to harmful, threatening, or challenging events or stimuli. It could also be defined as a condition that seriously perturbs the physiological and psychological balance of an individual. There are different definitions of stress, some which focus on the physiological mechanisms, some which focus on the psychological mechanisms, and some which focus on the environment posing a challenge. Here we'll be looking at primarily those definitions that look at a more physiological response because we're looking at neuroplasticity. Coming to the stress spectrum. So we know that stress can vary from daily hassles to life-threatening events. I am sure that all of us who've been parents have been faced with a large number of daily hassles in the last 2 weeks when schools have started. And I'm sure that we've also had images of life-threatening events occurring when we're waiting to see if our children have boarded buses or not, and if they're coming home or not. So when we go through that spectrum, we'll also see that stress effects tend to be mediated over a timeline. And this can vary between seconds, which are rapid effects, to months. Coming to what severe stress entails, this isn't in any particular order, but these are the events that would entail a severe stress on an organism. And if you look at it, some of it, including parental divorce or conflict, being forced to live apart from parents or from family members, the loss of a child, these are some events that actually entail chronic stress. In that stress continues to persist beyond an acute period of time, and we'll try and see how that changes things. So what we'll end up seeing is that this picture is, sorry, the text is almost unreadable, but it's basically of a cannery. And when in mines, miners used to carry a cannery because, well, the bird would die if it came into contact with methane, and so the miner would know when to run out of that mine pretty quickly. So we'll see that stress itself can be a warning of pretty significant events down the road. These are some of the experimental and stress paradigms that have been used to test it. Don't bother, it's a long list. Basically, this is how we created experimental, or not we, but rather experimental stress paradigms are created in animal models to replicate acute and chronic stress. And what's on your right are some of the tests that have been used to look at animal responses and how stress has actually changed these responses. Coming to the role of the stress response, this is the traditional definition. It's been to coordinate autonomic, neuroendocrine, and immune responses to eliminate potential homeostatic threats and achieve and adapt successfully. But over time, we've seen that the definition's starting to change a little bit. Whereas earlier we used to stress on trying to achieve homeostasis, it looks more and more that the role of stress response is really to mobilize energy to promote context-specific survival, especially in terms of acute stress. And when chronic stress is present, the system really isn't trying to sustain previous homeostatic levels. In effect, almost like resetting a thermostat, you look at the stress system actually changing homeostatic levels to reflect a new altered reality. So coming to what allostasis is, well, this word has actually two definitions. One is in which it's used in terms of stress, and the other when it's used in terms of substance use, where you've probably heard it a lot more if you've been a part of our previous sessions. Coming to the in terms of definition of stress, it's basically the physiological and behavioral changes which mammals adopt to combat the changes that stress creates. Well, when it's the organism is able to overcome these challenging circumstances and adapt successfully, it's called eustress. But when stress persists over a period of time, what you'll find is that there is a greater psychological response and eventually altered regulation of the homeostatic mechanisms. In terms of substance use, allostasis actually refers to that altered state of homeostasis that occurs because of adaptation to substance use. So in some ways, the definition is quite similar. How does this work? You'll find that when chronic stress exists for any period of time, there is a prolonged adaptation to that stress by various mechanisms. One of them is chronic hypothalamic pituitary adrenal activation. And because of this chronic HPA activation, you'll find that there is an increase in systemic glucocorticoid levels, an increase in neuropeptides such as CRF, and an increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines. What this leads to is that there is an increased risk. When I talk about this, I'm actually talking about early life stress. So in early life stress, there's an increased risk at later adulthood and adolescence, or the other way around, of increased mood and anxiety disorders, cognitive impairment, and metabolic dysregulation. So how does that quite work? So what essentially is happening is that chronic stress has led to what is called an allostatic load, which are all these changes that have occurred, which is in turn leading to this enhanced risk. So these are some of the stress activated mediators. The colorful boxes on the right are basically what stress response is determined by. For example, stress, there are anticipatory responses to stress, and those are primarily mediated by the prefrontal cortex. Whereas systemic responses to stress are when stress has already occurred, and these are primarily physiological responses. So you'll find that there's that different brain systems get involved when stress is anticipated and when stress has already started occurring. Various neurotransmitters are involved, including the norepinephrine system, the serotonergic system, and including adrenaline and the other systems too, including GABA, glutamate, and some of the other neuropeptides. You'll find that CRF and neuropeptides are a significant part, and steroid hormones, the glucocorticoids specifically, are a significant part of this response. Today we'll focus on the last two, though the neurotransmitters are a significant part of this response. They are more general, and our current interest is in the last two. So coming to the stress response itself, you look at, this is the HPA axis, and you'll find that three arms of at least the three systems that mediate stress response are the HPA axis itself, which starts from the hypothalamus, goes on to the pituitary and the adrenal gland, and of course extra hypothalamic CRF. This extra hypothalamic CRF is found in the amygdala, in the hippocampus, and certain areas of the frontal cortex. Interesting enough, when stress occurs, this extra hypothalamic CRF is also enhanced. One particular area which we're interested in is that CRF actually increases the responsiveness of the reward pathway to actual reward. So for example, enhanced dopaminergic release occurs because of CRF activation in these pathways. There's also, of course, finally the sympathetoadrenomedullary system, which releases norepinephrine, epinephrine in response to this activation. This pathway, we know, has a negative feedback loop, and you'll see that ACTH and levels and CRF levels are modulated by cortisol release. This is again something that we'll see is altered in subjects who tend to be at high risk. Let's just look at a few of those factors that we've talked about. The corticotrophin releasing factor or hormone basically is a neuropeptide. Its speed of action overlaps with neurotransmitters. It does have slower effects as well, because it also acts on polysynaptic and it has some non-synaptic actions. It's interesting because it's actually distributed in the CNS by volume transmission. Therefore, it's got a wider area of action than neurotransmitters. Of course, not as wide as those of the steroid hormones, which we'll see later, which tend to have a broader range of action. There are two CRF receptors that we know about, and it's putated that the CRF-R1 or receptor 1 has a role in initiating stress-related actions because of its enhanced affinity, reduced affinity, and the CRF-R2, which has a role in the termination of these actions. More on that later. Glucocorticoids. When we talk about glucocorticoids, we've all heard cortisol, corticosterone. Essentially, cortisol is what we find in humans and non-human primates, and corticosterone occurs in rats and mice. It's important to remember that glucocorticoids have a pulsatile nature of release with diurnal and even ultradian variation, and both baseline activity and responses during stress continue to be pulsatile, except that they vary in their frequency and their intensity. Glucocorticoids have a wide range of systemic and brain responses. We'll be focusing on the brain responses. However, please keep in mind that they have significant effects on gluconeogenesis and other systems as well. Coming to glucocorticoid receptors, there are two major types. There are the mineralocorticoid receptors and the glucocorticoid receptors. Why should we know about them? Well, the mineralocorticoid receptors are high affinity receptors. And if you remember the previous slide, we said that basal levels of glucocorticoids tend to be lower than stress levels. So when in a non-stress state, you'll find that mineralocorticoid receptors bind to glucocorticoids more than glucocorticoid receptors. And therefore, they help determine basal levels of activation of various pathways. There is a mineralocorticoid receptors help determine the circadian rhythm of the HPA and help in mnemonic or memory function. They have a more restricted distribution than the glucocorticoid receptors, though certain areas overlap, specifically the medial prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. Glucocorticoid receptors themselves are low affinity. What does this mean? It means that at stress levels of glucocorticoids, when glucocorticoid is increased, that is when binding occurs to the glucocorticoid receptors. So they're involved basically in the stress signaling process or initiating the stress reaction. And they have a wider range of distribution in the CNS, much larger than the mineralocorticoid receptors. It's important to remember that many of the actions of both types of receptors are through genomic effects and require hours, though there are non-genomic effects which are faster. They are slower than the neuropeptides and definitely much slower than the action of the neurotransmitter. Coming to what neuroplasticity is, now that we've seen the stress system, it's the ability to make adaptive changes relating to the structure and function of the nervous system, usually in response to a challenge or stimulus. So these could include morphological changes in brain areas, alterations in certain neural networks, including in their connectivity and in their function, and neurobiochemical changes. Also, we'll take a look in the next few slides at some of what neurogenesis actually does, or what happens to neurogenesis when stress occurs. So we perhaps all seen these slides from the NIDA slides and from Tappert et al. 2005, where we've seen that different things happen to the brain over the years. We have long moved past the concept that the brain kind of ceases to develop once it reaches its full size. We know that adolescence, for example, a large amount of synaptic refinement, changes in myelination can occur, and some of these changes, myelination specifically, continues much beyond the ages that we've actually thought of earlier. In fact, even perhaps sometimes even beyond the age of 30. So let's now look at what stress does to some of these neuroplastic mechanisms. Let's start with neuron morphology. So we'll see, we've all heard of hippocampal hippocampal regression of the length of dendrites in response to stress. So basically, this occurs to both chronic stress and to chronic glucocorticoid administration. However, it isn't quite the same in all brain regions. For example, the prefrontal cortex, there is a hemispheric variation to retraction, which is different. If you look at the diagram that's up, the first two are the control and the chronic stress in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. If you look at the next to the right, you'll find that there's a control and chronic stress in the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex, and you'll see that there's a difference. There's a difference in terms of the retraction in the amygdala response and in the hippocampal response, which comes to what I'm telling you. In that, amygdala dendritic arborization, unlike the hippocampus, is enhanced by a similar chronic stress paradigm. It's interesting that when stress is terminated, some of the synapses that were gone are actually replaced. And certain drugs that stimulate neuroplasticity, including antidepressants, prevent hippocampal stress-induced retraction of these dendrites. All of this plays a role in long-term potentiation, basically the long-lasting enhancement in signal transmission because of synchronous stimulation, which helps basically encode memory. And a lot of these mechanisms are involved in generating and encoding of memory related to stress. So to sum up, it has different responses across the brain. hippocampal responses and prefrontal cortex responses are different from orbitofrontal and amygdala responses. And we'll take a look and see what that means for us as we go move on. So if basically we've heard of neuron death, that stress kills neurons. We've also heard of depression being basically essentially a neuron killer. And some of these studies were in basically in dead wild vervet monkeys who face social isolation, in monkeys chronically treated with glucocorticoids, which showed changes in neuron morphology that were interpreted as dead or dying. These changes have, or these findings have not really been replicated in other studies, and it seems that inadequate brain tissue fixation or even delayed brain tissue fixation creates dark neurons that can be interpreted as dead cells. So what does this mean for us? Well, if you look at two models, for now there are lots of examples, but we'll stick to tree shrews and humans for no particular reason. But you'll find that in tree shrews, apoptosis in the hippocampal formation is a very rare event in relation to stress. And chronic stress itself may have a differential effect on cell death in certain hippocampal regions. Essentially, they're talking about CA1 and CA3. In humans, for example, hippocampal neuron numbers in depressed subjects do not significantly differ over time, though initial studies did point to that. In fact, it may actually be shrinkage of the neuronal cell body and a decrease in dendritic arborization, which is responsible for this change in volume. It also means that when the nerve cell shrinks, of course, there is less of a surface area for synaptic connections to be held and a less of a surface area for pathways to be formed. So essentially, cells don't really die. So what we used to fear that, the neurons are basically are killed off by stress or depression, it isn't probably as dire as what it used or what we thought it was. Coming to the next one, neurogenesis itself. Now, this is a very complicated figure, but neurogenesis has a very interesting history in how it was found. Finally, perhaps one of the latest evidences of neurogenesis came up only because an atom bomb was exploded and C14 was released into the atmosphere, and when we found carbon-14 in specific brain areas in post-mortem specimens of subjects. So it's interesting how neurogenesis was actually found. But what we do know is that it occurs in quite a few areas. What you'll see here is the hippocampus. You'll find that there's neurogenesis in the dentate gyrus, and it passes through the subventricular zone, through the rostral messenger system, if I'm not mistaken, to the olfactory bulb. You also see this complex collection of dots at the bottom. What they actually are is a representation of neuroblasts as they go through their various life cycle. So they start off with undifferentiated neuroblasts, they go on to amplifying neuroblasts, and then finally onto the differentiated forms. We know that there are some positive modulators of this of neurogenesis, and these include environmental stimuli, learning, exercise, running, estrogen. And what's been found is that there are differences in, for example, neurogenesis during phases of the menstrual cycle, and antidepressants. Some of the negative modulators, well, we have acute and chronic stress, we have NMDA receptor activation, aging, and glucocorticoids. So you can see that neurogenesis has both positive modulators and negative modulators. We know that most mammals, including humans, that neurogenesis occurs in the subventricular zone and the dentate gyrus as it's represented. But there are other species where there are neurogenesis in the adult substantia nigra. Fishes have a wide area of neurogenesis in their brains, and just when we thought we were king of the mountain, it appears that rates in animals decline less than rates in humans with age. So essentially, animals replace more neurons than we do as they get older. So coming back to our friends the tree shrews, we found that chronic social stress reduced hippocampal neurogenesis, and this effect depended on both the intensity and the duration of the stress. If you had to forget most things about the slide, please don't forget that second point. Both intensity and duration of stress are incredibly important, especially the timing of the stress. You'll also find that in rhesus monkeys, The prenatal stress actually reduced neurogenesis in adolescent individuals. So keep in mind that the stress actually occurs prenatally, but the effect is actually being seen in the adolescent organism. And in newborn marmoset monkeys, there was proliferation of the precursor cells, but differentiation into mature cells was not impaired. So essentially, impaired proliferation but not impaired differentiation was seen. What does this all mean? Stress has different effects in different species, obviously, but chronic stress tends to reduce neurogenesis and it tends to have effects which are long lasting. The third point that you should remember from the slide is that intensity and when stress occurs are quite important in mediating this risk over time. So how does stress act to do all of this? Well, they act via glucocorticoid levels themselves, where you can some of the experimental models, receptor antagonists such as mifepristone actually prevented this stress-induced reduction. In certain mice, genetic disruption of the mineralocorticoid receptor impaired adult hippocampal neurogenesis. If you remember, we talked about the mineralocorticoid receptors being important for basal levels of activation. And antidepressants themselves could act via certain modulation of the glucocorticoid receptor, and also by upregulating other neuropeptides like brain-derived neurotrophic factor and of its receptor. Stress also has effects on glutamatergic transmission and GABAergic transmission, which also tend to mediate this effect on neurogenesis. In depression, this is coming to the question whether, there have been studies which have looked at depression and neurogenesis and have stated that depression actually reduces neurogenesis. We know that the changes are probably a little more complex than that. Schizophrenia is probably more associated with decreased neurogenesis than mood disorders and depression. And certain just to confuse and muddy the waters a little bit, post-mortem studies in the hippocampus have showed decreased numbers of neural progenitor cells in the dentate gyrus. And there's a selective enhancing effect of antidepressant treatment in the anterior and middle dentate gyrus. Essentially, as the first point points out, this is a complicated mechanism. We probably don't know too much about it in terms of overall interactions yet, and more research will probably make this clearer in the future. Coming to another effect of stress, epigenetics and long-term changes. Epigenetics are basically environmental factors. They occur when environmental factors change the structure of chromatin and influencing transcription and changes in the genome. Essentially, DNA structure hasn't changed, but accessibility of DNA to mRNA and other cellular mechanisms changes. And this, interestingly, can be passed on from generation to generation. In tree shows, again, chronic stress paradigm showed an increase in heterochromatin in the nucleoplasma of the CA3 pyramidal neurons. But again, here you had a difference in the effect on CA1 neurons. Interestingly, in tree shows, just to be contrary, chronic cortisol secretion actually had the opposite effect. What does this mean? Well, heterochromatin basically indicates a reduced transcription of genes which are occurring. So you're looking at difference in transcription over genes over time, which are influenced by stress paradigms. Also, we probably are looking at different cellular pathways, including the involvement of the glutamatergic and endocannabinoid pathways to create a specific effect on stress as opposed to the glucocorticoid effect alone. In terms of human studies, maternal reports of symptoms ranging in severity from anxiety and depression to daily hassles during pregnancy led to worse neonatal outcomes and, interestingly enough, impaired cognition and social development over the lifespan, specifically up till the adolescent period. So this isn't true just for tree shoes alone. It seems that these changes can be long-lasting. So early exposure to stress leads to early HPA programming, which essentially is a chronic activation of this pathway. And this can lead to altered metabolic parameters, such as permanent hypertension, hyperglycemia, and increased HPA activity. But it can also lead to behavior suggestive of anxiety and externalizing symptoms in adulthood. So again, we're looking at a systemic reaction, but you can look at what you should take from this slide is that it is long lasting. That is, early HPA programming can lead to effects later in life. So, other studies, stressful experiences and environmental factors, whether in the prenatal or postnatal period, led to changes in mRNA expression, DNA methylation, and histone modification in the placenta as well as the fetal or neonatal brain. And these are all the mechanisms by which epigenetic changes occur. Some of them do not get passed down the proverbial genetic line, but some of them do. So you'll find that some of them don't survive mitotic, are passed only through mitotic changes, whereas some of them continue to be passed down through meiotic gene changes. Okay, this slide talks about nutrition and environmental toxin, but I promise it has nothing to do with instant noodles. The Dutch Famine Cohort study, which was a very interesting study that looked at infants who had been exposed to maternal deprivation or maternal nutritional deprivation during the first trimester and later trimesters, found that the effects of prenatal undernutrition on adulthood tended to be long lasting. They also tended to depend on the period of human gestation. So when undernutrition occurred during the first trimester, the changes tended to be more severe and more long lasting. Whereas when changes occurred in the third, or undernutrition was experienced in the third trimester, these changes were not as severe and were not, sometimes didn't occur in this cohort. High levels of blood, higher blood levels of lead are associated with an increase in behavioral disorders and ADHD symptom severity. And the domains of executive function and attention are the most prominently affected by lead levels. This is actually a study from Chennai, done in 2009 by Roy et al. In school. So coming back to the next thing, corticosteroids and myelination. This very complicated slide is basically telling you where are all the places at which corticosteroids can affect myelination. So myelination is affected by oligodendrocytes, both oligodendrocyte precursor cells, oligodendrocytes, which are what OPCs or precursors change into, and of course the microglial and astrocytic environment. It looks like corticosteroids can act on both proliferation and migration of oligodendrocyte precursor cells. They can affect differentiation into oligodendrocytes, and they can actually affect myelinating activity per se. They also have effects on astrocytic and microglial activity, and can also affect the secretion of certain soluble factors that affect myelination. What does this mean? Well, in sheep and rodents, corticosteroid treatment can significantly delay cerebral myelination in major white matter tracts, including but not limited to the optic nerve and corpus callosum. In other adult animal models, they can corticosteroids actually delay remyelination after experimentally induced demyelination, and these are affected by global transcriptional changes in CS treated or corticosteroid treated microglia. Funnily enough, the changes in microglia tended to be more significant than the changes in oligodendrocyte precursor cells and oligodendrocytes. So there's a lot to be learned from this in terms of, or there's a lot to learn in the future. But perhaps some of the actions of corticosteroids are more dependent on astrocytes and microglia rather than on the oligodendrocytes and oligodendrocyte precursor cells themselves. Stress and memory, and this, I thought what we'll do is that we'll just take stress and memory as an example of neuroplasticity and look at what happens to it over time. So one of the stress paradigms was a maternal stress separation paradigm for rodents, where infant rodents are separated from their mothers for a period of 1 to 8 hours, either singly or repeatedly. And this can be changed in terms of temperamental changes, removing the mother from the cage, removing the litter from the cage, removing only the rodent from the cage, or removing the whole litter from the cage. So it can be done in various ways. But what it did found to have was that there was altered CRF messenger, CRF mRNA expression in the paraventricular nucleus, which is where CRF is secreted from. There was also an increased CRF-like immunoreactivity in the locus coeruleus. And lastly, there was increased CRF receptor levels in both the locus coeruleus and the raphe nuclei. In adulthood, what it led to was decreased sensitivity to glucocorticoid feedback, as also a decrease in glucocorticoid receptor expression in both the hippocampus and the frontal cortex. So how does this link into memory? Well, when selective blocking of central CRF1 CRFR1 receptors in the week following the early stress period tended to abolish deficits in hippocampus dependent memory and long-term potentiation and dendritic structure in the CA1 region, as opposed to organisms or rodents that had only been given the early stress paradigm but not the RF1 receptor antagonist. Mice with a conditional forebrain CRFR1 knockout, essentially without this receptor, are resistant to the effects of chronic early life stress on cognition. Overexpressing the CRF postnatally in forebrain neurons actually mimicked chronic stress effects in rodents that had not been exposed to chronic stress. So essentially the CRF system seems to be a very important system in terms of mediating this response to, or this response of memory to early life stress. What we found though is that it's a little bit of a differential response. So you'll find that lower level short CRF exposure promotes synaptic function and plasticity, but high level and long duration exposure actually results in synaptic elimination. Some of these changes in CRF are also being seen in aging, depression and epilepsy over the lifespan. So again, as with most of the things, it's a little bit of a complicated response. There are different responses to different levels of CRF, but early stress and its effect on memory may be mediated by the CRF system. Glucocorticoids are, this slide is basically a summary of what glucocorticoids do at various areas in the brain, or the ones that we are interested in primarily. But what you'll find is that if you have to take anything back from the slide, the hippocampus is involved in terminating HPA axis responses to acute stress, while the amygdala or the basolateral amygdala is involved in the acute stress response initiation. And you notice that mineralocorticoid receptors tend to be what determines negative feedback. What it eventually means for us is that in terms of acute stress, emotionally salient memory formation is increased by glucocorticoids. This is one of the factors which can actually lead to vulnerability to PTSD. And you'll find that mineralocorticoid receptors are involved here. There is certain context-related information which is encoded for a variety of spatial and fear-related memories. And in here, glucocorticoid receptors are involved. And of course, acute stress can disrupt memory retrieval, however, in tasks that have already been acquired. So previous memories are difficult to retrieve when in the face of acute stress. Chronic stress, however, tends to disrupt hippocampal dependent tasks across the board. This is just an example in healthy human controls, where hydrocortisone application prior to a memory encoding task 30 minutes prior impaired memory contextualization performance, but 210 minutes prior actually improved memory contextualization performance. Cortisone also given in the night before sleep also tends to enhance encoding of memories and remembrance of memory the next day. So it looks like mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists tend to prevent this shift from hippocampal dependent learning to a striatum dependent learning, which is mediated by stress. Essentially, glucocorticoids are trying to shift the way that we learn from hippocampal dependent learning by activating the striatum dependent pathways. Also, certain single nucleotide polymorphisms which are associated with glucocorticoid sensitivity and decreased cortisol levels tend to modulate PTSD risk, as in those with without the polymorphism tend to be more resistant to PTSD than those with the polymorphism. So again, glucocorticoids here seem to be associated with memory formation, primarily fear-related, spatially related tasks, and they tend to disrupt cognition which is previously made. In terms of the risk for addiction, both population and clinical studies point to a high rate of initiation of drug use in those with recent negative life events, sexual or physical abuse, and lifetime of cumulative response to stressors. There are also baseline altered HPA dynamics which are associated with a higher risk chance to develop a SUD or substance use disorder in high-risk subjects. In fact, baseline HPA dynamics has been used to predict risk of substance use over time. Excuse me. Both CRF and glucocorticoid signaling alter the activity of the mesolimbic pathway intrinsically, enhancing the dopaminergic response to drugs, actually increasing the risk of addiction to substances over time. Lastly, there is decreased prefrontal cortical control of impulsivity, altered white matter connectivity, and increased externalizing symptom counts, which have been associated with particularly chronic stress. And here it tends to interact with other vulnerability factors to enhance risk for addiction in subjects. Can interventions work? Well, there are two theories. One is the critical period hypothesis, which is the first graph, and there is the progressive hypothesis, which is the second. What the critical period hypothesis says is that there is a single event, prenatally or postnatally, following which an effective intervention can work, but an intervention which is delayed will not change, including cognitive decline, reduced long-term potentiation, and dendritic atrophy as outcomes. What does this mean? It means that an intervention will only work within a restricted time frame, being ineffective after that particular time frame has passed. So if somebody says suffered early stress, this model would mean that if an intervention was started when the person had, say, reached the age of 20, it would not be as effective as if it was initiated at age, say, 2 or 3. There is another hypothesis which is the progressive hypothesis. And what this states is that early life stress sets into motion a series of effects which tend to occur during various parts of the lifespan. So what does this mean? Here, an intervention, even if it occurs later, would tend to alter some of these changes that are occurring, and would tend to mean that intervention could work even if it was introduced later. Even if it didn't reverse symptoms, it could ameliorate difficulty significantly. Which one is true? Well, we don't know. There is evidence for both. Certain changes, the best answer is that certain changes may well be programmed of early HPA programming may not be able to be changed with time. But certain changes probably tend to occur as time goes on, and these events can be modified by an intervention. So if we can intervene, we should. But if we had a choice to intervene, we should intervene as early as possible. What are the interventions that have been tried? There is a lot of evidence for a mounting body of interventions, including physical exercise, cognitive therapy, social service programs, meditation, pro-social behavior promotion, including life skill promotion, social emotional learning, executive function training, and mindfulness-based stress reduction, which we heard about during the case conference. And what this has meant is that there's been a lot of evidence in terms of altered bold responses on fMRIs. There's been altered EEG responses, especially in the gamma band to stress with these interventions. But one study that I'd like to share with you, and what you're seeing on your right, is a pre and post study, which is basically pre and post 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction. And what it showed was that there was a reduction in the size of the basolateral amygdala, which, if you recall, was responsible for initiating the stress response in the amygdala. And this reduction that you can barely see because the graph is very small, but trust me, it's there, is that they correlated positively with a decrease in perception of stress. So what is your take-home message from this slide? It does seem that certain interventions can actually reverse some of the changes that stress mediates. And so if we can intervene, it's worth intervening. Not all changes that are mediated by stress are unchangeable or immutable. So just to sum up, chronic stress is a time of high need. Basically, glucocorticoids, not only they do the things that we talked about, they activate glycogen metabolism, glucose synthesis, and increase adaptive capacity to acute stress. They also inhibit energy utilization by other systems which are not really useful for immediate survival, including growth, the immune system, and reproductive processes. Over time, chronic stress can lead to a deleterious effect on behavioral outcomes, including anxiety, depression, appraisal of responses, and behavioral flexibility. This is one way that it's been conceptualized. If you look at this slide, the green part is basically where environmental demand, which is on the x-axis, isn't very high. And therefore, system performance is good even with a low input of energy from the organism. The blue line that you're seeing in the middle is what is the actual response that we usually see. And the yellow part of the graph is what would occur if there was no limitation on the organism's ability to respond to stress. So essentially, over time, you'll find that if stress continues to persist, adaptive cost continues to rise, and you'll find that the blue line is eventually pushed closer and closer to the green line. And what you'll eventually find is that over a period of time, the organism's ability to generate a response is impaired. So glucocorticoid secretion must be context appropriate to enhance adaptability. Both hypersecreting when low demand is hypersecreting in conditions of low demand is detrimental, and hyposecretion in the face of high demand is also detrimental to the organism. So acute and chronic stress modulate neuroplasticity but can have different effects. Allostatic load accumulates when stress persists. Effects are mediated through the HPA axis, extrahypothalamic CRF, and the SAM system. Early stress exposure causes HPA programming. Effects can be persistent over the lifetime, and vulnerability to later psychiatric and metabolic disorders is mediated by these early life changes. Please remember that stress includes environmental and nutritional exposures, among others. Infections, all of these can be physiological stresses that have similar effects to psychological stress or environmental stress. Effects on neuronal arborization and volume account for the chronic changes that occur in brain volumes, while altered neurogenesis occurs to a lesser extent, and cell death probably contributes least. When stress occurs, is as important as the intensity of the stress that is occurring. Epigenetic changes play an important role in the changes that are passed down the genetic line to progeny, and interventions may be able to reverse some of these changes. And the earlier you intervene, the better. So, thank you. If there are any questions?
Yeah, go ahead, ma'am.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Is there any positive response for the stress also in our body, in neuroplasticity or any system?
Actually,
or it's all negative?
No, actually, it isn't negative. That's a very good question. If you looked at, I didn't talk about too much. Acute stress actually promotes certain very important context-based learning. So, acute responses to stress, even life-threatening stress, is promoted. If you look at emotional learning, spatial learning, is actually promoted by acute stress responses. And acute stress responses have a very vital role. They increase energy production while limiting certain other non-essential functions such as growth, reproduction, and the immune system to some extent. So what ends up happening is that acute stress is beneficial up till a point. When stress tends to the point, yeah.
And how about chronic stress?
Chronic stress really doesn't seem to have that too many good outcomes for the organism in terms of overall lifestyle. At least I'm not aware of the beneficial effects of chronic stress over the lifetime.
Okay, so in a way we can say acute stress is essential for the life also. As a thought, I'm asking.
Absolutely.
I hope you
like your last slide, low corticosteroid at a proper situation is the best.
Okay.
What it looks like, optimal corticosteroid secretion in a proper amount of stress is probably best. Yeah.
Corticosteroid secretion occurs in baseline levels and at stress levels.
Mm-hmm.
The problem occurs when stress has gone on so long that the organism can't adapt. And after a certain point, the organism changes its own, so to speak, to upregulate its own HPA activity. And that is when the problems start occurring. That this chronic regulation pushed various body systems out of gear.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay. I think there's a lot of compliments to Deepak presentation from Saurabh, Anubhav, and a lot of people. Ravi. Now the question, Saurav's question is: can we extrapolate any of these findings to deal with patients relapsing to substances under acute or chronic stressors? I think there are literature available now.
There's a lot of literature. We didn't put it in this slide because we wanted to make this about neuroplasticity.
Hmm.
But absolutely, drug responses, you've seen that stress itself can set the stage for vulnerability to addiction to be amplified. What it also does is that it changes drug acquisition. That is, when people start using drugs, their responses to drugs are changed because of the reward pathway changes that occur because of stress. So essentially, dopaminergic responses to drugs are enhanced. And so essentially, drug addiction tends to be even higher in those who are also facing chronic stress. In drug addictions as well, it seems that even, say, things like sexual abuse and negative life events can independently and cumulatively both affect addiction or risk to develop addiction over time.
Yeah, I think Saurabh's question was that, I think there are definite molecules with CRF1 antagonist, correct? Am I right? Antagonist.
Yeah, which are being,
There have been, see, unfortunately, this all started at least a decade back. But because toxicity after phase 2 trial, they're not able to go up. But they're working on the diet. Ranbaxy, I think one company is working the and people with obesity with CRF1 antagonist, and also indirectly use of prazosin has been found to be effective in addiction. But we are hoping a lot for CRF1 antagonist, and it may definitely come up for at least treatment purpose in view. Whether chronic substance use increases glucocorticoid secretion causing chronic stress.
That's a very interesting question. See, in terms of PTSD itself has been. Whether chronic substance use increases glucocorticoid secretion. Actually, it does. That's a very good question, and that's a very good point. Chronic substance use itself has also been linked to increasing the activities of the HPA axis itself. Drugs themselves can act as a stress because of the changes that they affect in neurotransmitter systems and in regulatory systems in the brain. So what you end up having is that HPA axis activity modulates dopaminergic responses, and drug use itself can modulate HPA activity to a certain extent. So you're absolutely right. Both can make each other worse. Dr. Saurabh Das. Okay. Dr. Mondal asks if post-traumatic stress reaction during the window of opportunity, that is within 12 hours of the event itself, does supplying glucocorticoids during this period prevent consolidation of traumatic memory, and if benzodiazepine worsens? Well, there's a lot of work being done in PTSD and risk to PTSD. We do know that glucocorticoids itself supplying may not help with PTSD. Certain CRF1 receptor antagonists in certain animal models of PTSD seem to maybe modulate the risk of developing severe symptom or reduce the symptom severity over time. But glucocorticoids themselves are probably not a great response to, or giving glucocorticoids will probably not benefit somebody in an immediate event and not help really prevent PTSD. Innate glucocorticoid increase already occurs in somebody who's facing a stress. So supplying glucocorticoids may not be the answer there.